In a small town in the southern United States, life was simple on the surface but deeply troubled underneath. The town had been divided for years, split not by geography or wealth but by race and history. Its streets were lined with old oak, trees and faded brick buildings that whispered stories of a painful past. For decades, this town had struggled to heal from wounds left behind by slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. But no matter how much time passed, the scars remained. Officer Daniel Grayson was one of those scars. He had served as a police officer in the town for over 20 years. To some residents, he was a hero, a man who worked tirelessly to keep the streets safe. To others, however, he was a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. Over the years, multiple accusations had surfaced against him, all involving black citizens. People claimed he used excessive force during arrests, made derogatory comments, and treated them unfairly compared to white suspects. Yet, despite these allegations, Officer Grayson always seemed untouchable. Internal investigations cleared him every time, and victims felt their voices were ignored. One such victim was Marcus Johnson, a young black man just trying to get through life. Marcus wasn't perfect, he admitted that himself, but he wasn't a criminal either. On a chilly evening last fall, his car broke down near the edge of town. As he waited for roadside assistance, Officer Grayson pulled up behind him with flashing lights. What happened next changed Marcus's life forever. According to Marcus, Grayson approached him aggressively, demanding identification without explaining why he'd stopped him. When Marcus asked what he'd done wrong, Grayson allegedly grabbed him roughly, slamming him onto the hood of his car. Witnesses driving by later reported hearing Grayson shout racial slurs while holding Marcus down. By the time backup arrived, Marcus was handcuffed and placed under arrest for resisting an officer. No other charges were filed, leaving many to question whether the arrest was justified at all. News of the incident spread quickly through the black community. Protests erupted outside the police station calling for accountability. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Brutality" filled the streets. Local activists demanded a thorough investigation, but the district attorney initially refused to press charges against Grayson, citing lack of evidence. Furious, Marcus decided to file a lawsuit against the officer, hoping to bring attention to the issue. The case eventually reached the courthouse, where it landed in front of Judge Evelyn Carter. Judge Carter was a highly respected figure in the legal world. Known for her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to fairness, she had spent years earning the trust of both colleagues and citizens alike. She was also black, the first African-American judge to serve in the county's history. Her appointment had sparked hope among marginalized communities, who saw her as someone who could finally address long-standing inequalities within the justice system. But Judge Carter knew the challenges ahead. This wasn't just any trial. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. The entire town was watching closely, and emotions ran high on both sides. Some believed Grayson deserved punishment for his actions. Others thought he was being unfairly targeted because of his profession. Even before the trial began, tensions simmered like a storm about to break. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Dozens of people gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. Inside, the air felt thick with unease. Supporters of Marcus packed the gallery, their faces etched with determination. Across the aisle sat Grayson's supporters, including fellow officers and members of the local police union. They wore stern expressions, silently vowing to stand by their colleague no matter what. As Judge Carter entered the courtroom, the noise faded into silence. Dressed in her black robe, she carried herself with quiet authority. Her presence commanded respect, even from those who disagreed with her decisions. After taking her seat, she looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning rows of anxious faces. She knew this trial would be difficult, not only because of its complexity but also because of the weight it carried. It wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about the larger fight for justice and equality. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, outlining the events of that fateful night. They played video footage captured by a nearby security camera, showing Grayson's aggressive behavior toward Marcus. The defense countered by arguing that Grayson acted according to protocol and that Marcus had resisted arrest. Witnesses were called to testify, each offering conflicting accounts of what happened. With every word spoken, the divide between the two sides grew wider. By the end of the first day, it was clear this trial wouldn't be resolved easily. Outside the courthouse, debates raged among spectators. Some praised Judge Carter for her impartiality, while others criticized her for allowing certain pieces of evidence to be admitted. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted answers. But deep down, they all wondered the same thing. Would justice prevail, or would the cycle of mistrust continue? Little did they know, the most shocking moment was yet to come. What unfolded next inside that courtroom would leave everyone speechless, and change the course of the trial forever. The second day of the trial brought an even heavier atmosphere to the courthouse. People arrived early, eager to secure a seat in the gallery. By the time Judge Evelyn Carter entered the courtroom, every chair was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, scribbling notes and snapping photos. The air buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited to see how the case would unfold. Judge Carter wasted no time getting started. After calling the court to order, she reminded both sides of the importance of decorum. "This is a place for truth and fairness," she said firmly. Her words hung in the air like a warning, though few realized just how significant they would become later that day. The prosecution began presenting its case. They called Marcus Johnson to the stand first. Dressed neatly in a button-down shirt, Marcus looked nervous but determined. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them to swear an oath to tell the truth. For many in the room, this was their first chance to hear his side of the story directly. Under questioning, Marcus recounted the events of the night he was stopped by Officer Grayson. He described feeling confused when Grayson pulled him over without explanation. "I didn't understand why I was being detained," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "When I asked what I'd done wrong, he got angry. He grabbed me, threw me onto my car, and started yelling at me." The prosecutor then asked about the racial slurs Marcus claimed to have heard. Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "He called me names, things I can't repeat here. It made me feel small, like I wasn't human." His words struck a chord with some in the audience who nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. Next, the prosecution played video footage captured by a nearby security camera. Though grainy, the clip clearly showed Grayson approaching Marcus's car and pulling him out forcefully. Gasps rippled through the gallery as people watched the officer slam Marcus onto the hood. Even Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable but intense. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine Marcus, things grew tense. Grayson's attorney, a tall man with sharp features, paced back and forth as he questioned the witness. "Isn't it true," he began, "that you refused to comply with Officer Grayson's instructions? That you became argumentative and uncooperative?" Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, sir. I just wanted to know why I was being stopped. I wasn't resisting. I was asking questions." The defense pressed harder, attempting to paint Marcus as someone who provoked the situation. But Marcus remained calm, sticking to his story. When the questioning finally ended, the prosecutor thanked him for his bravery in coming forward. As Marcus stepped down from the stand, supporters in the gallery gave him quiet applause. After a short recess, the prosecution called additional witnesses. One was a woman named Sarah Collins, who had been driving past the scene that night. She testified that she saw Grayson shouting at Marcus and using language she described as hateful. Another witness, a local shopkeeper, confirmed hearing similar remarks. Each account added weight to the prosecution's argument that Grayson had acted improperly, but the defense wasn't backing down. They argued that the witnesses couldn't hear everything clearly and might have misunderstood what happened. To counter the video evidence, they presented expert testimony claiming the footage didn't capture the full context of the arrest. According to their expert, Grayson's actions could be interpreted as standard procedure for dealing with a potentially dangerous suspect. By the end of the second day, tensions were running higher than ever. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered again, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some carried banners reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Hold cops accountable." Others stood silently, holding candles in memory of victims of police brutality nationwide. Inside, emotions simmered among those still waiting to testify. On the third morning, the spotlight shifted to Officer Daniel Grayson himself. Dressed in his uniform, he took the stand with confidence. His attorney guided him through a series of questions designed to portray him as a dedicated public servant doing his job. Grayson spoke about his years of experience, his commitment to protecting the community, and his belief that law enforcement officers often face difficult decisions in the line of duty. However, cracks began to show during cross-examination. The prosecutor zeroed in on Grayson's use of force and language during the traffic stop. "Did you call Mr. Johnson derogatory names?" the prosecutor asked bluntly. Grayson hesitated before answering. "No," he said firmly. "I treated him like any other suspect." The prosecutor pushed further, citing the witnesses who reported hearing racial slurs. Grayson grew visibly agitated, his jaw tightening as he denied the accusations. "Those people are lying," he snapped, raising his voice. "They don't know what really happened." Judge Carter intervened immediately. "Officer Grayson," she said sharply, "you will address this court with respect. Do not raise your voice again." For a brief moment, Grayson glared at her. His face flushed with anger. He muttered something under his breath, not loud enough for most to hear, but close observers caught a hint of hostility. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm cloud ready to burst. As the day wore on, the defense continued trying to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They emphasized Grayson's training and protocol, arguing that his actions were justified given the circumstances. But the damage had already been done. Witnesses had spoken, videos had been shown, and Grayson's own demeanor on the stand raised questions about his credibility. By the time court adjourned for the day, the divide between the two sides felt wider than ever. Outside, debates raged among spectators. Some praised Marcus and the prosecution for standing up against injustice. Others defended Grayson, accusing the trial of being politically motivated. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, and tempers flared as arguments spilled into the streets. Inside the courthouse, Judge Carter returned to her chambers, weary but resolute. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. The trial had exposed deep-seated issues within the community, issues that wouldn't disappear once the verdict was delivered. Still, she remained focused on ensuring a fair process, even if it meant facing challenges head-on. Little did anyone know, the most shocking moment of all was just around the corner. What happened next would stun not only the courtroom but the entire nation. By the fourth day of the trial, emotions in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The prosecution and defense had presented their cases, witnesses had been cross-examined, and evidence had been dissected from every angle. All that remained was closing arguments, final speeches meant to sway the jury one last time. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. The morning began like any other. Judge Evelyn Carter entered the room with her usual composure, her black robe flowing behind her. She took her seat at the bench and called the court to order. The gallery was packed once again, filled with anxious spectators who leaned forward, in their seats eager to hear the final words of both sides. The prosecution went first. Their attorney stood confidently, addressing the jury with passion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but powerful. "This case isn't just about one man or one incident. It's about accountability. Officer Daniel Grayson abused his power, violated his oath, and treated Marcus Johnson as less than human because of the color of his skin. We're here today not only to seek justice for Marcus, but also to send a message that this kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You've seen the video footage. You've heard from witnesses who described hateful language and unnecessary force. And you've listened to Marcus Johnson's testimony, a young man whose only crime was asking why he'd been stopped. The truth is clear and it's up to you to uphold it. When the prosecutor finished, the defense rose to deliver their rebuttal. Grayson's attorney paced slowly in front of the jury, his tone measured but forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we have here is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Officer Grayson followed protocol. He acted professionally, under difficult circumstances. Yes, the video shows physical contact, but let me remind you, it's part of his job to ensure compliance during an arrest." He turned toward the jury, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And as for these so-called racial slurs, there's no concrete proof, just hearsay from people who weren't there. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment. Look at the facts, not accusations, fueled by bias against law enforcement." His speech ended with a plea for leniency, urging the jury to consider the challenges police officers face daily. When he sat down, the room fell silent. Everyone waited for Judge Carter to give her final instructions to the jury. But before she could speak, chaos erupted. Officer Grayson suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was red, veins bulging in his neck. Ignoring the protests of his attorney, who frantically whispered for him to sit back down, Grayson shouted, "This whole thing is a joke. You're all biased against me." His voice echoed through the courtroom, startling everyone. Judge Carter immediately raised her hand, signaling for silence. "Officer Grayson," she said firmly, "you will remain seated and conduct yourself appropriately in my courtroom." But instead of obeying, Grayson pointed a finger directly at Judge Carter. "And you don't deserve to sit where you are." He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You've been against me from the start." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Spectators exchanged shocked glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. Officers stationed near the door tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. For a moment it seemed like Grayson might simply storm out of the room. But then something unthinkable happened. In one swift motion, Grayson reached for his sidearm. The metallic click of the holster opening sent a collective shiver through the room. Time seemed to slow as he pulled out his service weapon and pointed it squarely at Judge Carter. Pandemonium broke loose. People screamed, scrambling to get away from the danger. Some ducked under benches while others rushed toward the exits. Lawyers and clerks froze in place, too stunned to move. The officers in the room drew their own weapons, shouting for Grayson to drop his gun. Yet despite the chaos around her, Judge Carter remained seated, her expression calm but resolute. "Officer Grayson," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "you will put your weapon down now, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. For a brief moment, Grayson hesitated, his grip on the gun tightening. His eyes darted between Judge Carter and the armed officers surrounding him. Sweat beaded on his forehead as reality set in. He was outnumbered and cornered. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the weapon. It clattered to the floor with a deafening thud. Before anyone could react further, officers tackled Grayson to the ground, pinning him down and cuffing his hands behind his back. Shouts of "Get off me," and "This is insane" echoed as they dragged him out of the courtroom. The entire scene lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When the commotion finally subsided, Judge Carter called for order. Her voice, though steady, carried a hint of exhaustion. "Court is adjourned until further notice," she declared. With that, she rose from her seat and disappeared into her chambers, leaving behind a courtroom full of shaken faces. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, desperate for details about what had just occurred. Word spread quickly, and within hours the story dominated national headlines. Videos of the incident surfaced online, showing Grayson pointing his gun at Judge Carter. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from outrage to disbelief. For Marcus Johnson, the events left him reeling. Sitting outside the courthouse with his family, he struggled to process what he'd witnessed. "I never thought it would go this far," he told a journalist, tears streaming down his face. "But maybe now people will see how serious this issue really is." Grayson's supporters were equally stunned. Many refused to believe he'd actually drawn his weapon, claiming the video must have been edited or taken out of context. Others distanced themselves entirely, unwilling to defend such extreme actions. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials scrambled to address the fallout, issuing statements condemning Grayson's behavior and promising a full investigation. As for Judge Carter, she became the center of attention overnight. Letters poured in from across the country, praising her bravery and poise during the confrontation. Some called her a hero, while others simply thanked her for standing firm in the face of danger. Despite the praise, however, she remained focused on the task ahead. In interviews, she emphasized that the trial wasn't just about one officer. It was about addressing systemic issues within the justice system. That evening, as the town grappled with shock and disbelief, questions lingered in the air. What would happen to Grayson now? Would the jury still reach a verdict? And most importantly, what did this incident mean for the future of race relations and policing in the community? Little did anyone know, the answers to those questions were closer than they realized. The trial may have been interrupted, but its impact was far from over. The days following the courtroom explosion were unlike anything the small town had ever experienced. Shockwaves rippled through every corner of the community, leaving no one untouched. What had started as a trial about one man's actions had spiraled into something far bigger, a national conversation about race, authority, and justice. Officer Daniel Grayson was now behind bars, charged with multiple offenses stemming from his behavior in court. In addition to the original charges of assault and misconduct related to Marcus Johnson's arrest, he faced new counts of attempted murder, contempt of court, and brandishing a firearm unlawfully. Legal experts debated whether these charges would lead to separate trials or be consolidated into one massive case. Either way, Grayson's future looked grim. Stripped of his badge and disowned by the police department, he became a pariah overnight. Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Carter emerged as a symbol of courage and resilience. Her handling of the situation earned widespread admiration, not just locally, but across the country. News outlets hailed her composure under fire, noting how she maintained control even when a loaded gun was pointed directly at her. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "I respect Judge Carter" and "Courage and Justice," while petitions circulated calling for her nomination to higher judicial positions. Letters poured into the courthouse daily, thanking her for standing firm against intimidation. Despite the accolades, Judge Carter remained humble. She gave only a handful of interviews, always steering the focus back to the larger issues at play. "This isn't about me," she told a reporter during one rare appearance. "It's about addressing the systemic problems that allow incidents like this to happen. If we want real change, we need to have honest conversations, not just about policing, but about equality, accountability, and trust." For Marcus Johnson, life began to shift in unexpected ways. The spotlight that had once felt suffocating now brought opportunities he never imagined. Community leaders invited him to speak at rallies and forums about racial injustice. Activist groups reached out asking him to join campaigns advocating for police reform. At first, Marcus hesitated. He didn't see himself as a public figure. He was just a regular guy who wanted fair treatment. But after talking with his family, he decided to embrace the role. "If sharing my story can help someone else," he said, "then I'll do it." Marcus also found solace in reconnecting with loved ones. His mother, who had been skeptical about pursuing the lawsuit initially, hugged him tightly whenever they spoke. "I'm proud of you," she whispered one evening over dinner. "You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard." Friends rallied around him too, organizing fundraisers to cover legal fees and offering emotional support during tough times. For the first time in months, Marcus felt hopeful, like maybe his voice could make a difference. Outside the courthouse, protests continued, drawing crowds larger than ever before. People traveled from neighboring towns and cities to participate, carrying signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Justice without fear." Some demonstrators chanted Judge Carter's name, holding her up as an example of integrity in action. Others focused on broader demands, calling for body cameras on all officers, independent oversight boards, and mandatory de-escalation training. Local. Officials scrambled to respond to the growing pressure. The mayor announced plans to convene a task force dedicated to examining law enforcement practices in the town. Police chiefs promised reforms, including stricter guidelines for use of force and increased transparency in investigations. While some praised these efforts as steps in the right direction, others dismissed them as empty promises designed to placate critics without enacting meaningful change. Amidst the chaos, the jury tasked with deciding Grayson's fate deliberated quietly, behind closed doors. Their job had become infinitely more complicated after the courtroom incident. How could they separate their emotions from the evidence? Could they remain impartial, knowing that Grayson had threatened a sitting judge? These questions weighed heavily on their minds as they reviewed testimony, examined exhibits, and debated verdicts. After 2 tense days of deliberation, they reached a decision. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters of both sides packed the gallery, their faces masks of anticipation. Reporters jockeyed for position near the front, microphones at the ready. As Judge Carter entered the room, the crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The 4 persons stood clutching a slip of paper. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the room as the clerk retrieved the document and handed it to Judge Carter. She scanned it briefly before nodding for the 4-person to read aloud. "On the charge of assault." The 4-person paused, taking a deep breath. "Guilty." Cheers erupted from Marcus's supporters, while gasps of disbelief came from Grayson's side. The 4-person continued down the list. Guilty on misconduct, guilty on using excessive force, guilty on violating civil rights. By the time the final count was read, tears streamed down many faces in the room. It was a historic moment, a victory not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had fought tirelessly for justice. Grayson sat motionless, his head bowed as the weight of the verdict sank in. His attorney immediately vowed to appeal, but few believed it would succeed. With multiple convictions stacking up against him, Grayson faced years, if not decades, in prison. The courtroom emptied slowly afterward, with people lingering to process what they'd witnessed. Outside, celebrations broke out spontaneously, with hugs, tears, and chants of triumph filling the air. But even amidst the joy, there was acknowledgement that the work wasn't done. Judge Carter reminded everyone during a brief statement that the verdict marked the end of one chapter, not the entire book. "True justice requires more than court rulings," she said. "It demands commitment, from all of us, to building a society where fairness prevails and fear has no place." As night fell over the town, lights flickered on in homes and businesses, casting warm glows onto quiet streets. Conversations about what happened, and what still needed to happen, continued, late into the evening. For some, the verdict offered closure. For others, it sparked renewed determination to keep pushing for change. Whatever the future held, one thing was certain. The events of those days would leave an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of everyone involved. And so, the story moved forward. Not toward an ending, but toward a beginning defined by hope, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The verdict sent shockwaves through the town, reverberating far beyond the courthouse walls. It wasn't just a legal decision, it was a moment of reckoning, a turning point that forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and accountability. For Marcus Johnson, it marked the culmination of months of struggle, fear, and resilience. For Officer Daniel Grayson, it signaled the collapse of his career, reputation, and freedom. And for Judge Evelyn Carter, it reinforced her belief that justice, though difficult to achieve, is always worth fighting for. As news of the guilty verdict spread, reactions poured in from all corners of the community. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted among Marcus's supporters. People hugged one another, cried openly, and chanted slogans like, "Justice prevails," and "No more racism." Some held signs thanking Judge Carter for her courage, while others praised Marcus for having the strength to speak out. It was a rare moment of vindication, a glimmer of hope in a long-fought battle against inequality. Inside the courtroom, however, emotions ran high on both sides. Grayson sat silently, his face pale and expressionless as the jury foreperson read each count aloud. His attorney scribbled notes furiously, already preparing grounds for an appeal. Meanwhile, Marcus wiped away tears, overcome with relief and gratitude. When the final verdict was announced, he turned to his family in the gallery, embracing them tightly. They had been by his side throughout the ordeal, offering unwavering support even when the outcome seemed uncertain. For many Black residents of the town, the verdict felt personal. It wasn't just about Marcus or Grayson. It was about decades of systemic injustice, unaddressed grievances, and lives lost or ruined because of prejudice. "This victory belongs to all of us," said Pastor James Williams, a local civil rights leader, during a press conference later that evening. "It shows that when we stand together, when we refuse to stay silent, change is possible." But not everyone celebrated. Among Grayson's supporters, anger simmered beneath the surface. Some accused the jury of bias, claiming the trial was rigged from the start. Others defended Grayson, insisting he had been provoked into drawing his weapon. In online forums and social media threads, debates raged over whether the punishment fit the crime. Tensions flared outside the courthouse, where small groups of protesters clashed with police officers attempting to maintain order. Despite these divisions, there was no denying the significance of what had happened. The case had exposed deep fault lines within the community, forcing people to grapple with uncomfortable realities. It also put pressure on local officials to take meaningful action. Within days, the mayor announced plans to implement sweeping reforms aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and residents. These included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight committees to investigate misconduct allegations, and increased funding for diversity training programs. Judge Carter played a key role in shaping these initiatives. Recognizing the need for systemic change, she agreed to chair a task force dedicated to examining policing practices nationwide. Her involvement lent credibility to the effort, drawing attention from lawmakers, activists, and academics alike. During public meetings, she listened patiently to testimonies from victims of police brutality, advocates for reform, and even former officers willing to share their perspectives. Each story added depth to her understanding of the issue, fueling her determination to create lasting solutions. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rebuild his life. The trial had taken a toll on him emotionally, but the verdict gave him a sense of closure he hadn't felt in years. He threw himself into activism, traveling to nearby towns to speak at rallies and workshops about racial justice. His message was simple, yet powerful. We can't wait for someone else to fix things. We have to be the change we want to see. Marcus's newfound role brought challenges too. Some criticized him for stepping into the spotlight, accusing him of seeking fame or fortune. Others dismissed his efforts as performative, arguing that real progress required more than speeches and hashtags. But Marcus remained undeterred. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also believed that every voice mattered, even if it sometimes felt small. Back in court, preparations began for Grayson's sentencing hearing. Prosecutors argued for the maximum penalty, citing the severity of his actions and the harm caused to Marcus and the broader community. Defense attorneys countered by emphasizing mitigating factors, such as Grayson's lack of prior convictions and alleged emotional distress during the trial. Legal experts predicted a lengthy prison sentence, though appeals could delay its implementation indefinitely. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed once again. Supporters of both sides filled the gallery, their expressions ranging from hopeful to defiant. Judge Carter presided over the proceedings with her usual calm demeanor, carefully considering arguments from both sides before delivering her ruling. "Officer Grayson," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "You swore an oath to uphold the law and protect the citizens of this town. Instead, you violated that trust, not once but repeatedly. You used your position of power to intimidate, demean, and harm those who look to you for safety. And when held accountable, you escalated matters to an unimaginable degree, threatening the very foundation of our judicial system. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Your actions have consequences, not only for yourself, but for the countless individuals affected by your behavior. Today, this court imposes a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, without parole effective immediately. Grayson showed no visible reaction as deputies escorted him out of the room. His attorney vowed to appeal, promising to fight the decision until the bitter end. But for most people, the sentence represented a measure of justice long overdue. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such a seismic event. Conversations about race and policing continued, though they often shifted from heated arguments to constructive dialogue. Schools hosted workshops on implicit bias, businesses implemented diversity initiatives, and faith leaders organized interfaith gatherings to promote unity. For Judge Carter, the experience left a lasting impact. She had faced danger head-on, refusing to back down even when her own life was threatened. Yet she knew the work was far from finished. True justice required constant vigilance, collaboration, and commitment from everyone. As she reflected on the trial during a quiet evening at home, she found comfort in knowing that she had done her part to move the needle forward. And so, the town began to heal. Not fully, but enough to keep moving. The scars of the past remained, reminders of lessons learned and battles won. But amid the pain and uncertainty there was also hope, a fragile yet resilient belief that better days lay ahead. Little did anyone know, the ripple effects of the trial would continue spreading far beyond the borders of the town, inspiring others to demand accountability and strive for equality in their own communities. What had started as one man's fight for justice had grown into something much larger, a movement fueled by courage, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of fairness. Months passed since the trial ended, but its echoes continued to resonate throughout the town and beyond. What had begun as a local incident had grown into a national conversation about race, accountability, and justice. People across the country watched closely, eager to see whether this small town could transform itself, or if the changes would fade as quickly as they had come. For Marcus Johnson, life slowly returned to normal, but with a newfound purpose. He became a voice for those who felt silenced, traveling to nearby cities to share his story at rallies, town halls, and schools. His speeches were raw and heartfelt, often leaving audiences in tears. I didn't ask for this, he told a packed auditorium one evening, but if my pain can help someone else find hope, then it's worth it. Marcus also collaborated with organizations advocating for criminal justice reform. Together, they pushed for legislation addressing police misconduct, racial profiling, and systemic inequality. Their efforts gained traction, drawing support from politicians, celebrities, and grassroots activists alike. Some critics dismissed him as a poster child for anti-police sentiment, but Marcus shrugged off the negativity. "I'm not here to hate cops," he said during an interview. "I'm here to make sure good cops aren't overshadowed by bad ones." Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Carter continued her work on the bench, inspiring countless others with her example. Her leadership extended beyond the courtroom. She chaired panels, gave lectures, and mentored young lawyers passionate about social justice. Though some accused her of overstepping her role as a judge, she remained steadfast. Justice isn't confined to verdicts, she reminded skeptics. It's about creating systems that protect everyone equally. The reforms implemented in the wake of the trial began showing results, slowly but noticeably. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, leading to increased transparency during interactions with the public. Independent oversight committees reviewed complaints against law enforcement, ensuring investigations were fair and unbiased. De-escalation training programs taught officers how to handle tense situations without resorting to violence. These measures weren't perfect, but they represented progress, a step toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Still, challenges persisted. Not everyone embraced the changes willingly. Some officers grumbled about being micromanaged, while others resisted new policies outright. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly during traffic stops or protests. But even amid resistance, there were moments of reconciliation. Officers began attending community events, listening to concerns and working alongside residents to address shared problems. It wasn't easy, but bridges were slowly being built. In the broader context, the trial sparked discussions far beyond the town's borders. Journalists wrote articles analyzing the case, scholars studied its implications, and filmmakers documented its impact. Social media campaigns highlighted similar incidents nationwide, amplifying calls for reform. The phrase "justice without fear," originally coined by Judge Carter, became a rallying cry for activists everywhere. For many Black residents of the town, the trial served as validation. Finally, their voices were heard. Finally, someone was held accountable. Yet they knew the fight wasn't over. Racism and inequality ran deep, requiring sustained effort to dismantle. Community leaders organized workshops, book clubs, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering understanding and unity. They understood that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were committed to staying the course. Grayson's name faded from headlines as time went on, though whispers of his fate lingered. Behind bars, he struggled to adjust to prison life. Once respected or feared by colleagues, he now faced isolation and scorn from fellow inmates. Appeals filed by his attorneys dragged through the courts, offering little hope of overturning the verdict. For Grayson, the future looked bleak, a stark contrast to the power and privilege he once enjoyed. Yet his downfall served as a cautionary tale. Law enforcement agencies across the country used his story as a training example, warning recruits about the dangers of unchecked authority and prejudice. Instructors emphasized the importance of empathy, professionalism, and accountability. "This is what happens when we lose sight of our duty to serve," one trainer told a group of cadets. "Don't let pride or fear blind you." As the months turned into years, the town transformed in subtle yet significant ways. Conversations about race became more open, less taboo. Schools introduced curriculums focused on diversity and inclusion, teaching children to appreciate differences rather than fear them. Local businesses hired diverse staff and supported minority-owned enterprises. Faith communities came together, hosting interfaith services and cultural exchange events. Even the courthouse bore witness to change. A mural depicting scenes of justice and equality adorned its exterior walls, painted by local artists inspired by Judge Carter's courage. Inside, plaques commemorated landmark cases like Marcus Johnson's, reminding visitors of the progress achieved and the work still needed. For Judge Carter, the journey reinforced her belief in humanity's capacity for growth. She often reflected on the day Grayson pointed his gun at her, recalling the moment she chose calmness over panic. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she liked to say. "It's acting despite it." Her actions that day inspired countless others to stand firm in the face of adversity, proving that even in the darkest moments light can shine through. As for Marcus, he found peace, not just externally, but within himself. He forgave Grayson, not because he believed the officer deserved it, but because holding on to anger felt heavier than letting go. "I don't want to carry that weight anymore," he explained to a friend. "I've got too much living to do." And so the town moved forward, not forgetting its past but learning from it. The scars remained, reminders of lessons hard-earned. But amid the struggles and triumphs, there was hope, a fragile yet resilient belief that fairness and equality were possible. The trial had been a catalyst, igniting a movement that refused to dim. What happened next wasn't just about one racist cop or one courageous judge. It was about people coming together to demand better. It was about recognizing that justice requires more than laws. It demands hearts willing to listen, minds open to change, and hands ready to build. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the fight for justice was far from over.